I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and I'm so excited today to be joined by Tamara Lawrance to talk all about her latest film, The Silent Twins. And I wanted to start by talking a bit about the initial research that went into this role, because I imagine it was a very in-depth process. The film's based off of a book that Marjorie Wallace wrote, who was a journalist, but there's so many other facets of details that you would have had access to look into, from footage of the twins, the sisters, some of their writing, which has influenced the film in a lot of ways, and their words being used. And so I was really interested in how you approach the research process and how that really helped you in finding a window into this character and starting to understand her on an emotional level outside of the way that other people wrote and spoke about her.
Yeah, well, exactly that. I think you're bang on. What was so useful about this process was, one, actually, the film was postponed because of lockdown. So we had a bit more time. And so like the teacher and the director and I sat and went through the book chapter by chapter and sort of, discussed kind of what they were going through at the time, pulled kind of details that we thought might be useful to help add more nuance to the script. But then also, we each spent that period compiling sort of like verbatim quotes from the twins as well. So I from each chapter like lifted interesting things that I thought Jennifer said, or kind of transcribed sections of her diary and her stories and stuff, which was exactly as you said, really useful to get into the psyche of her and understand them and humanize them from the inside. And it was so useful to see actually the ways in which they were very much typical teenage girls going through kind of the normal angst of worrying about being accepted, being cool, fitting in, the boys that they like, what they're going to do with their lives, which was just such a huge antithesis to the depiction of them in the media, which was of this like sinister, mystical, otherworldly kind of twinship that, for me, before encountering this audition and everything, I had them in my mind in folklore as serial killers. So it was like it completely turned everything I thought about them on its head. And yeah, I think having the verbatim diary entries, they essentially archived their entire lives. It was that, for me, was the most invaluable resource to really see the nitty gritty of every sort of high and low in from Broadmoor especially, but from them being teenage girls in their room that were still playing with dolls. And so that was how we got into it. And then beyond that, we also had like a dialect coach and a movement coach that helped us to find the physical and sonic parity to help us get more into like the twin body.
Yeah, and you're talking there about, they're teenage girls and they're playing with dolls, and that's part of their creative outlet in their imagination with one another. And it's quite interesting because we do, like you said, we do see them go through some of the same experiences that other teenage girls go through, but kind of there's almost like a little bit of a delay and a lag in things. We see what does romanticism look like for them because they haven't experienced it, because they have been in this bubble to a degree, in a cocoon with one another. And so how did that inform elements of the character for you in terms of thinking about what are some of the experiences that she wouldn't have had that she would have if she was out there in the world socializing with everybody around her, but that she still yearns for and wants to have an understanding of?
Yeah, exactly. I think because of that cocoon that they lived in, for me, I understood them existing in these different extremes. On one end, there was like an infantilization because they were so detached from community and their peers. They stayed longer in that sort of childlike state and used the dolls in order to kind of live out the lives that they didn't get to live. And that was actually the root of their journey into being authors as well. So the storytelling started from them creating these very in-depth biographies about each of their dolls, and them all having families and interactions and playing out kind of lives and deaths in excuse me, in a sort of Sylvanian family-esque village that they created for their toys. But then on the other hand, there was melodrama, and I think because they existed so much in their imagination, every experience was heightened, which I think the film does really well. It kind of creates this like sensory feast of color and sound, which contrasts to, you know, how those scenes where we see them from the outside, where they're very silent and very still and moving in synchronicity. I think internally, they were romantic, like high poets. There's a bit in Broadmoor where Jennifer had a visitor, and she sort of wrote in such an intense detail, kind of him reaching for the sugar and bringing, how she was too nervous to bring the cup to her mouth, and how she thought on the outside that she was giving a very coy smile, and everything was in HD. And so I think, yeah, them existing in that sort of that in a very internalized bubble, for me, kind of it exploded itself into these other extremes quite nicely.
And the silence in itself is really interesting, because obviously it creates this real quietness. It creates that cocoon and bubble that we were just talking about. And at the same time, there's kind of a strength to it in holding their silence as a protectiveness against the world around them and the way that they've been treated and the way that they've been viewed. And so how did you want to go into finding those moments of silence with Letitia and really thinking about it in that real dichotomy of, you know, this is actually a strength and a power that they're wielding for themselves to protect themselves from the outside world, and not necessarily the weakness that's being perceived by others?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really great point and question, is that silence was a pact and a protest that they made. In the documentary, you see June say, you know, we tried to speak, but they didn't understand us. And then we thought, okay, if they don't understand us now, they won't understand us ever. And so they use their sisterhood as a way of protecting their energy. And so we lent into that by becoming just like friends and familiar with each other, and working together every night to kind of find moments in which we could kind of add in the looks with the eyes, or kind of gestures with the pinky, or things like that, like these little motifs to show that we had something that was just between us, which I think also contrasts quite nicely with the fights, which were also very true. Like there was intense love, but also intense kind of like vehement hatred for each other at times as well. And so that I think that balance is quite nice in the movie, with these moments between the young Tanzanians of them just like tearing at each other's throats. And I think it was important as well to have that in there for people to understand that they could speak, they just chose not to. And I think that's an important distinction, because I think it was their way of maintaining agency in a world that was otherwise in which they were otherwise at a disadvantage.
Yeah. And you touched upon there that obviously it was this incredibly close bond between the two of them, full of love, but there was conflict as well. And with Jennifer in particular, you know, even though they're twins, she was the younger one by a few minutes. And, you know, I've heard you kind of mention that you felt like there was a bit of jealousy that came from that. Was that something that you found in researching and kind of reading her writing and her words? And how did you feel like you wanted that to play out in terms of the dynamic between the two of them? Because you do such a great job with Letitia of having these moments where it really does roll between those different emotions in singular instances.
Thank you. From the diary entries, Jennifer spoke about twinship in such an interesting way. She had such an interesting perspective that made me think, compared to my other like broader research around twins, about how dysphoric it must be to have someone that is an extension and reflection of you, but also entirely not you, but also you share exact same DNA, and how having someone at that close comparison to you must bring up so much about identity. And Jennifer said things like, Cain killed Abel. No twin should ever forget that. Which I think is such an amazingly powerful thing to say, actually. And she also said, my real twin is out there somewhere, and she has my exact same rising sign. She was born at the same time as me. She likes what I like. My real twin has no differences, because in the space where there's differences, there is space for them to be compared and judged against one another. And they were very much in their youth when it came to kind of like scholarly tests and kind of people testing whether how socially apt they were. And Jennifer always fared slightly worse. And she was younger, and she felt like she spoke extensively about feeling that June was the prettier one. Which, because Jennifer had like a scar on her nose, but in the film, what we did is I was wearing these sort of prosthetic teeth, and there was like, and so I sort of lent into a self-consciousness, I guess. I think Jennifer is spoken about in the media as being the more dominant one, but from reading her diaries, I could just see that she was entirely insecure. And that insecurity sometimes manifests itself in trying to put other people down in order to kind of like feel better about yourself. And so I really wanted to humanize her for people to see how kind of fragile and vulnerable she was, which then became the catalyst for the volatility, rather than sort of playing her as like a despot, because then I think if you don't care about her, you don't feel you don't feel any sense of loss. You just think, oh, poor June is free now from this terrible person that's been ruining her life for almost 30 years. I think it was important to see love as a thread in this movie, I felt. And so that's what I tried to kind of think through, like, what are the ways in which I love her? What are the ways in which my love is toxic?
And with a lot of the dialogue in the film, there is this extreme silence, but there are moments where they do talk to other characters. There's the moment when they're teenagers and there's the guys that they really like and they start talking a little bit. There's the moment where, Marjorie, a character in the film as well as a journalist, comes into Broadmoor and becomes someone that they do feel comfortable and they do trust enough to speak in front of. And so for you, how did you find the way in which something felt justified enough for her to say anything? Because when someone doesn't speak much, when they do, it means so much.
Yeah, exactly. I think with the boys, it was about intoxication, or it was like that was also the first time they got high, and the first time that they had sex and things like that. And I think it was about being intoxicated, not just kind of like with substances, but with lust, kind of like that thing that comes over you when you start to like someone. It was a period of newness. And also it was a way, not only I think the substances like helped them to lose inhibitions, but also it was a way in which they were accepted, like sex as a vehicle to community, to intimacy and to connection. And so I think that was ultimately what was the barrier in the first place, because of the bullying and the moving around, and they didn't feel connected to anyone and safe enough to be vulnerable, which I think that summer with the boys gave them. But also, Marjorie coming in and saying, like, if I were to tell your story, how would it begin? And I think also that sense of being listened to, like having someone in Marjorie that understood them and that understood the scandal and the injustice of what was happening to them, and felt compelled to tell it. And Marjorie worked very hard, she stayed up every night for years transcribing their diaries onto I think what was the typewriter, she said, in those days, or and by hand in some passages, to make sure that all of their work was understood and archived, so that she could kind of have the point in the perspective from which to write the articles and to build a case in defense of what was happening to them. So I think that's those are the reasons why they felt comfortable enough to speak to those people.
And going back to what you were talking about when it is the intoxication of substances, one of the scenes that I really love is that moment where it's the two of them walking through the underpass. And then it kind of breaks into this moment of choreography, because it feels like it's that marriage between the imagination and the way that we've seen their stories were represented on screen and things inside of them, but also the realism with the concoction of everything in that moment. And so I wanted to ask about finding the right tone for a moment like that, which marries those two sides, but also just the choreography of that coming together.
That was actually the last scene we ever shot, which is very special. And I think the vision for that came through, obviously it's a very fantastic director that very much understood the necessity of these sort of these sort of larger than life moments, and how it was necessary to include their imagination as a motif throughout the whole piece. That married with the 80s soundscape and our amazing kind of composers and everything. And then the choreographer we worked with, a lot of our movement work was also through dance. And so we spent a lot of time kind of getting into the dance moves of the era, and would use that as actually Letitia and I as a way to kind of like get into the rhythm with one another in preparation for the day or for certain scenes. And so we understood that moment as a sort of as elation, sort of post-coital, post-friendship, kind of a way of visually depicting the high and the adrenaline of this first experience. And so we understood that as a kind of what was happening in the piece. But otherwise, we got into it through dance, and there was a whole big choreography from, like, obviously that scene had been edited, but it was a whole thing. And it was really enjoyable. I think we understood that moment as one we can lean into as fun, and actually it being in towards the end of the second act, as it were, one of the kind of last almost kind of potent moments of fun that we see them have before it descends into the sort of Broadmoor section. And so it was a very important scene that we all just worked really hard to enjoy.
And with the movement overall, what was the initial starting point of you and Letitia working together with a movement coach? Because it's such a fascinating connection that you have to have in terms of being scene partners with one another, because it's not about waiting to react and respond to what the other person's doing. It's not even looking at each other and having to create the same moment together, even just silently, picking up crisps at the same time and kind of tapping them together and then eating them at the same moment without making eye contact.
So that those bits came from different things. So the movement with the movement in terms of the synchronicity, actually a lot of was inspired by the younger twins. And so Kaya the movement choreographer worked with Leah and Ava first, and spent time kind of helping them to get into this synergy, and using kind of like pace as a way, understanding almost in like a very Buto-esque practice, like using slow movement as a way in which to kind of allow yourself time to feel your partner in the peripheral vision, but also to create a sense of unity from the outside. If you're moving slow enough, nobody can tell who's leading. And so I think that was the sort of offshoot. And so we watched a lot of the little girls work, and then we did that ourselves. And obviously physically, Letitia and I are quite different, but we used portrait, we used music and dance to kind of find a language in which we eventually landed in a kind of the same space, to understand that maybe the things we need to do in our bodies are also different in order to find the similarity. Like maybe I need to put my shoulders back, but maybe Letitia needs to hunch her thing forward, and then that makes us look more similar because obviously we have quite different statures. And so there was things like that, but then also the moment, as you picked up on with the crisps, came from a documentary that Tish and I watched about twins in, where were they? It was like Hungary or something like that. They're these really interesting twins. One of them was an artist, and the other was quite unwell, and they had this really strange relationship in which like they refused to like dress alike or anything like that. They thought it was like silly when twins did that, but they were really, really catty and quite infantile and would kind of like pick fights with each other in the most kind of ridiculous ways. But one of them had anorexia, and because she didn't want the other sister to kind of because the sister that didn't have anorexia didn't want her sister to lose too much weight, so they had this pact where they had to eat the exact same amount of things. And so like that's where we got the whole kind of thing with like the peas and the milk and like the girls having the same amount of everything. We watched that and we thought, oh, this would be interesting to layer into our film. And Jennifer and June did do things like this, but it was interesting seeing it in another pair of twins, like this watching them literally break crisps up to the exact same thing, or kind of get one plate of food at a night out and dinner and split it exactly in half, so that they were always eating the exact same thing, and one of them would never be heavier or lighter than the other. And so kind of that, it was also the broader research around twins in general that gave us some of those nuggets.
That's so interesting. And when it came to the moments of transitioning in and out of the silence and the stillness, it's quite interesting because it's not the moment that someone walks in, they just freeze in whatever motion. There's kind of almost a beat as they kind of cocoon together and kind of focus in on each other, or just look down and look directly away from anything around them in their peripheral vision. And was that something that came from the movement coach watching the younger performers, or was that something that you and Letitia found?
That was something that came from our director, I think, actually. She said it was important for them not to become statues. There was still like a life, an inner life that was working, and there was a decision that was being made in every moment to kind of become mute or become still. And I thought, and then also underneath that, obviously Letitia and I were working to layer in this sort of idea of checking in with one another, and so like it was useful to be to not have to kind of suddenly morph into mannequins, but to understand that at every moment there's a sort of somebody is taking the lead. And so is it, we suddenly go slow, we suddenly go quiet, and then you look to me and I look to you, and who's leading this time? Okay, and what are we doing? Are we okay? And and just having that unspoken language that came from all of these years of pact and familiarity. It's so cool that you noticed that. Very astute. Thank you. These are really cool questions. Thank you.
Of course. I also wanted to ask about, you were mentioning before a dialect coach that you were working with as well. And I was interested in whether that was specifically working with them on the affectation and the way of speaking, because you have taken, you've kind of like mastered the accent and have a very specific tone and intonation in the dialogue along with Letitia, or if it was about, working with a dialect coach in terms of language as a form of their communication and the way that they speak with one another in this secret language.
It was a bit of both, but probably predominantly the former. Hazel Holder was our dialect coach. Really, really amazing detailed work. She used the documentary to essentially break down she transcribed everything that June said in that entire documentary, and then broke down every line into tone, pace, range. So we understood a kind of framework within which they spoke, and how I think our dialect was broken down into private public. There were a few categories, so we understood like the ways in which our language might have more range when we speak to one another compared to when we speak to other people. The influence of also kind of like the West Midlands and the Barbados in there as well. Certain vowel sounds. Hazel kind of was just so excellent at fine-tuning all of these things, so that we worked with her off of this database she created for us that was entirely rooted in June's actual speech.
And when it came to playing this role, you know, you're playing this character over the course of being a teenager until the age of about 30. So it's several years. And in particular, the parts of the movie that take place once they've been institutionalized at Broadmoor. I was interested in what the challenges were in creating that sense of emotional fractures and deterioration, but in a way that's not completely linear. It's not the moment that they're placed there that everything breaks down. You know, we do see moments of light, we do see moments of joy in them. You know, you see them going to a dance and trying to kind of make the most out of every situation around themselves. Still the dynamic with Marjorie, which pulls them out of one another, but essentially you're carrying your character to a point where she's saying, I think I'm going to die and it's okay. And I thought that was a really fascinating non-linear arc to have to create over the course of several years in about half the movie. And so what were the challenges that came with that?
I think the honoring the length of time was a challenge to try and understand how do you show, as you say, how do you show 11 years in half an hour? And essentially you can't. You just have to sort of get the essence of every scene, the heart of every scene across in that moment as much as possible, which I think then speaks for itself, as you say, in this sort of like cyclical thing. Like, where are they in the cycle? Are they fighting? Are they enamored with one another? And I think for me, I wanted to make sure that by the end it felt like she had like a weight, that something was more that something had sort of like gone past the point of return. And it speaks a lot in the book about Jennifer being quite ill in those last, like, throwing up and not taking food and stuff in those last months in Broadmoor. So I think it was hard to kind of to honor the cycle and not lean into the victimhood of the situation, but to understand that they were trying to live as much as possible to find. So those moments of, you know, wanting that, even though it's harrowing and disturbing and kind of funny, but those moments of wanting a partner, wanting a life partner, wanting the father of your child, even in somewhere like Broadmoor, is something that we might find hard to understand. But for them, it was them trying to make the best of their circumstances. And so sort of playing against the somberness of everything, but also at the same time it was difficult because it was very disturbing and upsetting personally, but also trying to play sensitively things like being sedated or being in isolation, and the research around that and understanding how that messes with people's heads, like being alone, being separated not only from your twin, but in, you know, not really seeing anyone for long periods of time. And Jennifer spent a lot of time, they spent most of their time in Broadmoor apart, actually, on different wards, and Jennifer spent more time in isolation than June, because she was rebelling a lot more as the years went on. And then amidst all of that, they were also, you know, there was also their trial that kept being postponed of when they were going to be released. And so, yeah, I think honoring the kind of the reality of what was happening to them, whilst trying to be succinct and to the point with every scene that we had in Broadmoor was challenging. But I think the director obviously knew what she was doing, and knew how she wanted to carve the story to allude, at the very least, to the extent of what they were going through. But obviously the film doesn't touch on even the half of it, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a fascinating role in terms of everything that it required of you as a performer and as a scene partner working with Letitia. So it's been really fascinating to hear so many of the details about everything that went into that. Thank you so much, Tamara. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mara. It's been so good to talk to you. Great interview. Thank you so much.